Hello, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the sessions at COTISO National Conference that you've been to. My name is Kester. I'm an assistant professor of international education at Keimyung University. And for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to present from a new chapter that I have out in a book called Pedagogy of Vulnerability. So I'll be reading excerpts from that chapter and sharing them with you. But first and foremost, I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy at home, and that we can get through this pandemic sooner than later, hopefully. All right, so this is a chapter from a book called Pedagogy of Vulnerability. It's an edited volume by Maria McKenna and Edward Brantmeier out of the United States, and it's published by Information Age Publishing in 2020. The chapter that I have in it is a co-authored chapter with my co-author, Hilary Crimmen, from the University of Cambridge. And our chapter is titled Barefoot Hope for Peace, Vulnerability in Peace Education. So I'm going to read some of the excerpts from here. I'm not reading all of it. If you are interested, you can contact me and I will provide you an electronic copy of the document, but I'm just going to read a few excerpts from it to give you a sense of what we're getting into. Okay. Vulnerability is an act of dialogue, in dialogue and through dialogue. Hence, in this chapter, we will enact our vulnerabilities through a dialogue with each other. Drawing on Deleuze and Guattari and Freire, we accept that our voices are multiple and entangled with discourses and materialities that make and are made by us in turn, and that each of us represents an intersection of various historical possibilities and embodied relations. There are 1,000 different plateaux here, to paraphrase Deleuze, upon which we exist in any moment. Our dialogue moves us into, out of, and across these plateaus as we engage with each other, knowing that the co-creation that we articulate is both structural and ephemeral at the same time. The act of dialogue is concurrently familiar and vulnerable. Through it, we place ourselves in a position of consumption, reproduction, and critique. Furthermore, given the surveillance cultures that we live in today, with smart technologies grasping at our every move and students with smart technologies in the classroom, audio and video threatening our anonymity and freedoms, these vulnerabilities are particularly amplified for us as scholars and educators. To acknowledge and interrupt these multiple materialities, we have chosen to enter into a vulnerable dialogue on hope in contemporary education. That is, me and my co-author from Cambridge. The markings and the products this produces provide a material reality that invents and reinvents our subjectivities. We hope that we will mirror collectively, from our authorial voices and the feedback that we receive, a sense of the vulnerable situations in which many contemporary educators find themselves. We want this to be particularly useful to those who choose a pedagogy of vulnerability. Now, this pedagogy is selective and purposeful. It's not a random pedagogy. And it's one that I think many of us will be familiar with as educators in universities and secondary and primary schools, working with students in a second or a foreign language. We will discuss the pedagogical and methodological implications of this throughout the chapter. The chapter unfolds as a series of questions and responses. So Hilary will ask me a question, I'll respond, I'll ask Hilary a question, Hilary will respond. We're emulating throughout this Freire's lines of inquiry and critical pedagogy from Freire's books where he had dialogues with his co-authors. So the idea of a dialogic paper is not new. It comes out of Freire's work from the 1980s and 1990s. And we are attempting to ground this in our Barefoot Hope. By Barefoot Hope, what we mean is an optimism grounded in our experiences that makes us act on faith that a better world really is possible. It is not naive hope, a simple wish, but an embrace of the radical change that is possible through personal empowerment and collective action. So we begin first with positioning ourselves in the paper. And Hilary starts first. I ask her a question. Hillary, you speak a lot in your writing about the importance of acknowledging that every voice is a voice from somewhere, and that the artifice of the objective academic voice from nowhere has done much harm in times of modernity. Where is your voice situated? Hillary goes on. I am white, British, and female, and have been a peace educator for almost 30 years. My stance as a pacifist, supported by Quakerism, requires that I give significant attention to issues of structural and cultural violence in society. My roles as an educationalist, as a school teacher, charity worker, consultant, trainer, intergenerational mediator, teacher, educator, lecturer, PhD supervisor, and so on, means that my voice is mediated by the context of schools and education more broadly. I am currently situated within the academy in one of the world's highest-ranking universities, and I do not underestimate the privilege and the platform that I enjoy to speak about peace education. I hope that I do this in ways that unsettle powerful hegemonies, that offer alternative imaginaries for peace education, drawing on the global East and South, and that place embodiment, affect, and care, ecosystemic thinking, and spirituality at the heart of the educational enterprise. Therein, however, lies some of my vulnerabilities. I am particularly vulnerable to being written off as a hippie, someone who does not do gold standard research, who does not bring in large-scale externally funded research grants, and who does not reliably inform policymakers about what works. I write within my niche. Even the language that I use is tentative. It does not capitalize on hegemonic discourse, the self-evidence of concepts such as reliability, validity, significance, and impact. The qualitative research stories that I tell take new forms. I recognize with Lincoln and Denson in their 2011 work that the old story of qualitative research will no longer do. This is not easy because, to quote Denson and Lincoln, open quote, the new story is not yet in place, and so we look for the pieces of the story, the ways of telling it, and the elements that will make it whole, but it hasn't come to us yet. So we are now the ultimate bricoleurs, trying to cobble together a story that we were beginning to suspect will never enjoy the unity, the smoothness, the wholeness that the old story had. Close quote. This often comes across as a lack of purpose and clarity to those who are used to more traditional academic discourse. Hillary continues, also, whilst my gender and the low socioeconomic status of my original family often prompt me to feel like an imposter in my university, I nevertheless acknowledge that nowadays I belong to a powerful elite. It is this same powerful elite that I often critique, and that this undermines the ground that I walk on. I tell myself that I am working for change from within, but I often wonder whether this is what I have to say in order to carry on. I am perhaps settled for a while on one of Deleuze's plateaux. And then she inquires about my positionality. So I will share a little bit about my own positionality in the paper. I too acknowledge the importance of personal and professional reflexivity in our work, and knowing who I was and who I am becoming toward a critical praxis in education. Knowing this gives me purpose and keeps me grounded. I, like Hillary, also come from a difficult family financial background, and this in part drives my work to confront structural and cultural violence, especially around notions of epistemic violence. This anchors my work in the practical. My voice is mediated by my role as a transnational academic, working for 15 years abroad, and this has led me to interest in cosmopolitanism, D/post-colonialism, and epistemic justice. I have worked within peace-building education in East Asia, East Africa, and Latin America. These experiences guide me to reflect on nationalism, race, gender, and privilege in the global field, and within education and development work more generally. In this respect, my current teaching and research agenda emphasizes higher educational efforts to denationalize, decolonize, and de-epistemologize peace-building education through efforts toward transnational, transrational, and transformational education. Vulnerable pedagogy is embedded within this framework as I draw on narrative and experience, my own and others, to challenge ethnocentrism, neoliberalism, and other systemic challenges of our times. And I continue more with my own positionality, but I'm going to skip a bit of it here to move on to the section about our conceptual framework of how we frame this work. An assemblage of literatures. This is my voice speaking. To understand vulnerability, I draw on an assemblage of literatures. Over 20 years ago, Kelchersmans, in 1996, described vulnerability as the sense that one's professional and moral identity is in question. I suppose that this is one type of vulnerability, that type created by others and your own doubts of yourself. But what interests me more is the type of vulnerability one is willing to accept when he or she dares to do something unorthodox. This vulnerability in education is that which is practiced when educators and students enact a process of self and mutual disclosure in the classroom. When educators choose to share autobiographical material or invite students to do so as well in a brave space, putting oneself out there invites discomfort, uncertainty, and the possibility of seeing the phenomenon anew. Like this, Brené Brown in 2015 describes vulnerability as the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. Thus, through vulnerability, or though vulnerability may seem frightening and dark, and perhaps the opposite of hope, it may actually represent the beginnings of empathy and human connectedness that are so needed in learning spaces. The challenge is to facilitate vulnerability sensitively. So I've been influenced by different strands of thinking, including, first, the social constructivist and humble insights from Freire's dialogues, which we began with. And this is in the work by Horton and Freire in 1990, Shore and Freire in 1987, so on and so forth. Second, feminist literatures, including that by Cynthia Inlow and Patty Lather, Betty Reardon, and Elizabeth St. Pierre. Third, the affective turn in education and social theory. This is in the work of Sarah Ahmed, Megan Bowler, and Michelino Zembylas. Fourth, writing on the therapeutic culture of learning. This is in the work of Brunella, Ecclestone, and Brunella. Fifth, the marketization of education and neoliberal critiques of this work by Henry Giroux. Sixth, lines of thought on the precariousness of contemporary life in the work of Bauman, Butler, and Standing. And seventh, critiques of psychosocial peacebuilding in education in the work of Beckerman and Zembylas and Vanessa Pupovac. The confluence of these literatures informs my thinking and critiques around this issue of vulnerability. This diversity of literatures hence underscores my barefoot hope as I reflect on the eclectic, intersectional group of scholars and practitioners who have articulated their different visions, doing radical change from radically different settings, uncertain of the consequences of that work, and persevering in the face of uncertainty. This hope is amazingly contagious. So Hillary asked, perhaps we can start to draw out some key elements of our pedagogy of vulnerability. And there are 5 core characteristics of a vulnerable educator that we would like to highlight here. The vulnerable educator is first, he or she enters into the teachable moment with all of her and himself, body, mind, head, heart, and spirit. Second, the vulnerable educator is open to the other, noticing them, beholding them, delighting in their presence. Third, the vulnerable educator allows others to affect him or her, is challenged, confirmed, inspired by others. Fourth, the vulnerable educator takes note of the learning that does occur and plans for development and growth. And fifth, the vulnerable educator practices critical yet compassionate thinking. These 5 areas go back to Deleuze and Guattari and Freire, so let us elaborate. First, it seems to us that a pedagogy of vulnerability necessitates the presence of the whole self and acceptance of being in and committed to community with others. Students and scholars must commit to entering learning spaces holistically and with intentional presence, if the learning is to be both vulnerable and transformative. Second, in this act, learners and teachers must open themselves up to the other. Otherwise, walls are built and defenses constructed that inhibit transformative learning. Of course, such walls are built in response to deep-seated and perhaps unconscious vulnerabilities, the sorts of unacknowledged vulnerabilities that find themselves manifest in ethnocentric, racist, colonial, and patriarchal discourses and practices. Here, the vulnerable educator must work sensitively to bring down such walls. Martin Buber's I-thou relationship is instructive here. Buber helps scholars and students to relate to each other as fully human, protecting against dehumanization in everyday exchanges. Third, opening oneself to others sets the foundation to be changed by the other. This is difficult, vulnerable, and authentic, especially as we enter the post-truth era of echo chambers and lack of engagement with difference. Edward Brantmeier in 2013 says that practicing vulnerability requires you to, and this is quote, open quote, to open yourself, contextualize that self in societal constructs and systems, co-learn, admit you do not know, and be human, close quote. Brantmeier's conception overlaps with Freire's in its focus on co-learning, contextualizing the world through the word, and offering humanistic humility. For both Freire and Brantmeier, of particular import is what André Keat, Denise Zinn, and Kimberly Portu refer to as mutual vulnerability. In other words, the act of vulnerability, like piecework, is relational. It loses its power if educators and students are not open to being changed by the other. Fourth, one must plan to sustain the change both personally and socially. And fifth, students and scholars must learn to discern between the vulnerabilities that we cannot escape, that are just a part of life, and the vulnerabilities that are manufactured. In other words, not all vulnerabilities are equal. The vulnerabilities that we cannot escape can be the starting point for learning how to live together better. The latter manufactured vulnerabilities, however, are parts of systems of domination and oppression that must be interrogated and disrupted. This fifth and final characteristic of the vulnerable educator, the need to be both compassionate and critical, is key in our view. A pedagogy of vulnerability, even as it turns itself inward toward confession, sharing, and compassion, also must turn itself toward a politics of the possible. If some vulnerabilities are indeed manufactured, as we have suggested, however, therein lies hope. Alternatives are within the realm of possibility. Thus, we suggest that a pedagogy of vulnerability invites profound possibilities for social change, and that indeed this is fundamental to the social purposes of education. It is what education is for. We are arguing that vulnerable education is integrally social. For example, the classroom is only but one space to assist students in working toward justice, peace, compassion, and social change. If we start with I, or with the self, we can move towards Buber's I-thou, and from there towards discovering new possibilities within and between ourselves and our communities at various levels, from the local to the global. Vulnerable teaching and learning, drawing on feminist, genderqueer, and radical literatures, acts as a powerful conduit for personal and socially transformative possibilities. So in conclusion, what we have sought to do in this chapter is to explore the role of vulnerability within our teaching in institutions of higher education, as well as schools and beyond. Upon reflection, we have delineated 5 core elements that define our own practices of a pedagogy of vulnerability. Key to these is holding a dialogic community with others and allowing ourselves to be affected by them. Deleuze and Guattari explain that this dialogue enhances understanding and possibilities, and that the middle is by no means an average. On the contrary, it is where things pick up speed. Freire propounds a faith in men and women and in the creation of a world in which it will be easier to love. Through this, we do not suppose to have any final words, but instead we invite other peace scholars and higher educationalists to augment and challenge this dialogue in an effort to promote space for vulnerable learning in schools, universities, communities, and elsewhere. Vulnerable pedagogy is by definition unending, open to change, and becoming. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into what the chapter offers in delineating a pedagogy of vulnerability through 5 different fundamental aspects of that pedagogy. Okay, thank you very much. And again, if you would like a full copy of the paper, you can get this by emailing me at kevinajkester@gmail.com. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of National Conference.